Across 2,300 kilometers of front line, speed was once again a key element in the strategy for Trans-Baikal Front, and a heavy emphasis on motorized transport characterized resource allocation prior to hostilities. As soon as the Trans-Baikal began its attack on the 9th of August, the value of these transports was quickly demonstrated in the hostile territories of Mongolia and then Manchuria itself. The Japanese suspected that an invading army would attack along a possible 2 lines of advance, and they positioned their defences accordingly. At strongholds like the city of Hailar, the Japanese fortifications were well established, but the Soviet commanders remained confident. With the huge resources available to him, including 10,000 guns and mortars and some 2,400 tanks, Marshal Milovsky decided to attack using 10 lines of advance. One of the areas from which an attack could be readily predicted was the valley gap in the Khingan Mountains in the northwest. Japanese fortifications were especially heavy in the regions of Hailar and Pokhotu, and the Kwantung Army could not have been especially surprised to engage troops of Soviet 36th Combined Arms Army on the 9th of August 1945. In the days that followed, the fighting in the northwest was amongst the fiercest witnessed in the entire Manchurian campaign. For the attack on the stronghold of Hailar, a key role fell to the men of the 205th Tank Brigade. Having crossed the river Argun, this armoured detachment swept south towards the stronghold of Hailar. In just 12 hours, they covered 100 kilometres and secured an initial position in the city. But the Japanese fought tenaciously against this forward detachment. It was only after 24 hours of bitter engagement that the 205th Tank Brigade were joined by their colleagues of the 9th Rifle Regiment as the fighting continued. It was 8 days before the region of Pokhotu was finally subdued, and the defences at Hailar held out for a further 24 hours. The men of the Japanese 8th Independent Brigade and the 119th Infantry Division covered themselves in glory. But long before the end, they knew that the Soviet investment they faced was no more than a diversionary episode in the unfolding drama. The Soviets had known only too well of the Japanese strength in the region, and Soviet planners had been careful not to allocate the best troops for this sector of the Manchurian attack. War is necessarily an enterprise that requires cold, calculating thinking. In simple terms, the Soviet commanders were prepared to suffer large losses amongst the men of the 36th Army in the pursuit of their diversionary objectives. The real Soviet thrust was far away in the south, and from the very beginning, its progress was spectacular. Furthest south of all, the Soviet Mongolian Combined Cavalry and Mechanized Group were tasked with a march across the Mongolian desert towards the cities of Dolonor and Kalgan. By the 11th, they had advanced 200 kilometers. Similar progress was reported on the following 2 days, and by the 14th of August, the objective of Dolonor had been achieved. The sheer speed of the advance meant occasional problems with maintaining supply lines in the dusty terrain. But with the assistance of the so-called ship of the desert, the camel, the remarkable march of the Soviet Mongolian force continued. After the capture of Dolonor, the Cavalry Mechanized Group now set off further south with the ambitious aim of joining with Chinese troops in the region around Peking. Despite fierce Japanese resistance at Kalgan, the objective was achieved in style, and on the 21st of August, the Soviet commander Pliev was able to order a dramatic symbolic gesture to emphasize the scale of his men's achievement. That day, the Soviet Mongolian Combined Cavalry Mechanized Group made a ceremonial crossing of the Great Wall of China. The progress of 17th Combined Arms Army was hardly less remarkable. With the Japanese not expecting an assault over the supposedly secure Grand Khingan Mountains, the Soviet troops were able to effect a march towards the Yellow Sea with little in the way of enemy resistance. In this sector, it was the dusty terrain and the heat of the desert sun that presented more of a problem than any Japanese defense. In temperatures of 35 degrees, heat stroke was an inevitable problem for the time of year, and yet the seemingly relentless advance continued. It was the same story across the Trans-Baikal front. On virtually every avenue of advance, the progress of the Soviet forces was overwhelming. Many units reported gains of over 100 kilometers per day. The achievement of the 6th Tank Guards Army was especially noteworthy. In the first 3 days of the offensive, this elite armoured force covered a total of 350 kilometres over difficult mountain terrain as they headed for the Manchurian plains. As events unfolded, the speed of this advance presented the greatest difficulties of all. After crossing the Grand Hingan Mountains on the 11th of August, the 6th Guards Tank Army found itself immobile on the plains. The advance had been too good. Fuel had run out. But now the front commander, Marshal Malinovsky, demonstrated his commitment to the progress of the offensive. Instead of consolidating the considerable gains already made by the 6th Guards Tank Army, he ordered an airlift of fuel involving no fewer than 400 planes of his 453rd Aviation Battalion. By the time the advance was able to resume fully on the 13th of August, the situation on the Trans-Baikal front was already clear. The Japanese were in disarray. The sheer speed of the invasion had taken them by surprise. In the face of an army marching forward at 100 kilometers per day, the defending forces had little choice but to withdraw into fortified positions, to be taken out at the leisure of the Soviet commanders. A well-organized retreat was impossible under the circumstances, and by the 14th of August, after just 5 days of fighting, the Japanese leadership knew that the battle for Manchuria was effectively over. They also knew that the war itself was lost. It was on the 14th of August, 1945, that the Japanese Emperor Hirohito issued the order for the Imperial Army to cease fighting. 5 days after the second atomic attack, Japan accepted the Allied terms for surrender, and the Second World War was virtually at an end. In Manchuria, some Japanese units accepted the order and laid down their weapons. But in other battle zones, the Japanese fighting spirit continued to show itself. For many commanders and many ordinary soldiers, the very idea of surrender was inconceivable. In dozens of locations across Manchuria, the Soviet forces were compelled to continue their assault as besieged Japanese units fought on to the death. In the chaos of the war zone, many Japanese simply failed to receive the ceasefire order. On other occasions, the order was ignored with defiance. But the overall success of the Soviet offensive was now indisputable. As the fighting petered out, Marshal Vasilevsky moved to capture every major population centre, leaving the troops that chose to fight on isolated in the country. By the 19th of August, formal ceasefire negotiations opened between the Soviet Union and Japan, and the Manchuria offensive was effectively complete. The puppet state of Manchukuo was now consigned to history. For its nominal leader, Henry Puyi, 10 years in a Chinese prison lay ahead. For the Manchurian population, the Soviet offensive was a great act of liberation, and the invaders were greeted as heroes. With the Japanese ejected, the path was clear for the restoration of Chinese sovereignty over the Manchuria region. In 1946, the Soviet Union withdrew its forces from the Manchurian lands, its troops departing with the cheers of ordinary people ringing in their ears. The acclaim was well-deserved. The Manchuria campaign was an overwhelming display of military power, executed according to a coherent strategy of aggressive warfare. The scale of the Soviet victory can be suggested by the casualty figures published at the end of hostilities. According to the Soviet Union, over 87,000 Japanese were killed and some 594,000 taken prisoner. By contrast, Soviet casualties were just 30,000, with 8,219 listed as killed. But for all this overwhelming success, the Manchuria campaign remains one of the least well-known of all Second World War operations. It may be that students of the war have been more concerned with other dramatic events of August 1945. But there can be no doubting the achievement of the Soviet forces. In a matter of days, they succeeded in capturing a territory the size of Western Europe, and so doing, ended the might of Imperial Japan forever. History will always recognize that the land of Manchuria was the final battlefield of the Second World War.